after serving only 11 years in jail for the brutal manslaughter of 4-year-old Martin Brown. And 3-year-old Brian Howe, she was released at the age of 23. No one will ever know the whereabouts of a woman who, at the tender age of 11, took the lives of 2 young boys. Our story starts deep in the inner boroughs of Newcastle in the United Kingdom, a place called Scotswood. The families that lived in the soon-to-be-demolished houses were lower-income families waiting to be rehoused by the council. The children of those families were allowed to run free and play unsupervised from 2 years old. Children often played in the abandoned homes and the wasteland close to the railway line. It was a different time, and no one suspected the dangers ahead. It was Saturday evening, on the 25th of May 1968. 4-year-old Martin Brown went out to play with his friends in the abandoned homes, but his parents started to get worried when he didn't come home. Martin would often play outside with his friends and come home in the late afternoon for his tea, but he never made it back that day. One day after his disappearance, the local kids sadly discovered Martin's little body at one of the abandoned homes not far away from his home. June Richardson was mourning the death of her little boy, Martin Brown, when she received an unnerving visit. The little girl she recognized as one of the children in the neighborhood, Mary Bell, was on her doorstep, and she had a strange request. She asked to see June's son. Taken aback, June let the girl know that Mary couldn't see her son because her son had died. Mary said, "Oh, I know he's dead. I want to see him in his coffin." This was not the only strange event surrounding little Martin Brown's death. Soon after his death, the local nursery school was vandalized, and when police arrived at the scene, they found a few eerie, handwritten notes stating that Martin's death wasn't an accident. One said, "I murder so that I may come back," and another said, "We did murder Martin Brown." A lot of the circumstances surrounding Martin's death were suspicious. The 3 boys who had initially found Martin in one of the abandoned buildings they were playing at were shortly joined by 2 girls who stumbled across the scene. The 2 girls were Mary Bell and her friend, Norma Jean Bell. Despite their similar last names, these 2 girls were not related. The girls watched as a local tradesman performed CPR on Martin, to no avail. The small boy had sadly died. The police could not figure out what could have caused Martin's death, because other than the small amount of blood and foam found around his mouth, his body displayed no other clues that could point to any one manner of death. However, the police did find an empty pill bottle near his body, and took this to mean that he must have accidentally overdosed. The police had told June Richardson that her son had died from ingesting pills. Later, the coroner declared that Martin had not died from swallowing pills, but that his cause of death was suspicious but undetermined. The community was outraged. They protested and pleaded with the council to demolish the dangerous abandoned buildings. Some local children even got involved with the protests. One of those children was little Mary Bell. Norma Jean joined her as they carried placards and marched. On the evening of the 31st of July 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe did not come home after a day out playing with his dog. When dinner rolled around, and he still hadn't come home, his parents began to worry and enlisted the help of the neighborhood to find their baby boy. The neighbors were all too happy to help, even the local children joined in. Mary and Norma Jean offered to help and join the search for Brian. Close to midnight, the search party found Brian's body in a wasteland. The state of his body made it clear that he had been murdered. He had cuts all over his body, and his neck was bruised from where it looked like someone had strangled him. In addition to the cuts and strangulation marks found on Brian's neck, he also had superficial stab wounds on his thighs, cuts on his genitals, and a chunk of his hair had been cut off. However, The most spine-chilling mark found on his body was the letter M carved onto his body. The strangulation marks baffled coroners. It seemed that the force exerted on Brian's neck was enough to kill him, but was not enough force to have been inflicted by an adult. The only reasonable conclusion was that another child had killed Brian. What child does this to another child? It clearly wasn't an accident. The police threw all they had at the investigation. They went door to door asking people if they had any information that could give them a clue as to who had committed this horrible crime. By this point, they had also concluded and told June Richardson that her son Martin's death probably wasn't an accident after all, and was likely connected to Brian's. They interviewed around 1,200 children, but it was their interviews with Mary Bell and Norma Jean Bell that had them curious. Not only were they displaying strange behaviors from the girls, but they noticed a severe lack of empathy from Mary Bell. The stories the girls told about that day just didn't sit right with the police. The girls admitted to playing with Brian, but claimed to have not seen him after lunch. Details of Mary and Norma's account of that day kept changing. And then, during one of their subsequent interviews, Mary told the police a story that could solve their entire case. Mary told investigators that on the day of Brian's murder, she saw him playing with one of the boys in the neighborhood. While the boy and Brian were playing, Mary said she saw the boy hit Brian. She also claimed to have seen this boy holding a pair of damaged silver scissors. After hearing this story, police knew that Mary Bell, the baby-faced 11-year-old girl, may be their killer. You see, scissors matching this description were found near Brian's body, and the marks found on his body were made using these scissors. Details about the scissors were never released to the public. So how would Mary know about the scissors unless the story she was telling was true, or B, she was the killer? The problem was that Mary's story could not have been true, because the boy she claimed to have seen playing with Brian was at the airport that day, so he had a solid alibi. Police interviewed Norma again on the 4th of August 1968, and it was during this interview that Norma claimed that on the day of Brian's murder, Mary had taken Norma to see Brian's body. She said that Mary told her how much she had enjoyed killing the boy and even showed her the razor she had used to carve the M in his belly. Norma took the police to the place where she said Mary had hidden the razor, and the police were able to locate it. Norma later made a full statement admitting to actually being there during the murder. As the evidence against Mary began to pile up, the police made a connection between her and the handwritten notes found at the local nursery school. After hearing about the suspicion against Mary, her school teacher, Mr. Foster, decided to go over her workbooks to check if she had written anything about the deaths of the two boys. On the cover of one of her school books, she had written "Boy found dead in the old house." Within the book, she had also written further, "There were crowds of people besides an old house. I asked what was the matter. There has been a boy who just laid down and died." Beneath this, she had drawn a picture of the dead body of Martin Brown, and next to it, a bottle and a pill which she labeled tablet, as well as a workman finding the body. None of this information had been released to the public, so how did she know the details of how he was found so clearly? When police interviewed Mary once more and let her know what Norma had said, Mary became extremely defensive and called Norma a liar, denying the whole thing. She finally admitted to being there when Brian was killed, but insisted that it was Norma who was the one who killed him. Unfortunately, the police still did not have definitive proof that Mary had murdered the boy, so they let her go. However, freedom was short-lived for Mary, because when a detective saw the look on her face during Brian's funeral, he knew that he had to arrest the girl before she was killed again. After further questioning, both girls' stories started to fall apart. Norma started cooperating with the police, implicating Mary. Mary Bell claimed she was there during Brian's murder, but tried to blame it on Norma. Finally, Norma and Mary were arrested on the 7th of August 1968, the day of Brian's funeral. During a psych evaluation before their trial, it was determined that Norma was intellectually delayed and had the mental capacity of an 8-year-old. Mary was found to suffer from a psychopathic personality disorder and was the mastermind of these crimes. The prosecutor told the court that the reason for Mary Bell's murders was solely for the pleasure and excitement of killing. Trial. The prosecution presented their mountain of evidence. Norma's confession, the interviews with both girls, and the fibers found on both boys matched a dress Mary owned. In the end, Mary was convicted of the manslaughter of both Martin and Brian and served 12 years in prison. However, she did not get a murder conviction because the jury believed that her psychopathic personality disorder diminished her culpability and that she couldn't be held fully accountable for her actions. Norma was acquitted of all charges as she was deemed an unwilling accomplice who had fallen under a bad influence. It is hard to believe that a young child could commit such crimes. Was Mary predestined to be a killer? Or did something happen that changed the course of her life forever? Mary was born on the 26th of May 1957, and the first words Mary's mother said when she was handed her newborn baby were, "Take that thing away from me." Mary's mother, Betty McCricket, was a 16-year-old sex worker married to Mary's stepfather, Billy Bell, a man known to be abusive and a violent alcoholic. Betty would often disappear for days at a time and leave Mary and her older sister with their stepfather. When Betty was home, she would abuse Mary horribly. Mary was also oddly accident-prone. On one occasion, she fell from a window. Neighbors, however, claimed they witnessed Betty throw Mary out of the window. This fall caused a head injury, which might explain her psychopathic tendencies. Another time, Betty claimed that Mary accidentally overdosed on sleeping pills. However, it is now believed that Betty actually fed Mary these pills and intentionally caused the overdose. The clumsiness was a cover for all the times Betty physically abused her. Some attribute the accidents to Betty's determination to end her life, while others see apparent symptoms of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Nevertheless, Betty enjoyed the sympathy and the attention her daughter's accidents brought her. Perhaps the worst of the abuse was the sexual abuse that Mary suffered because of her mother. Her mother, who was a sex worker, allegedly offered Mary to her clients when Mary was just 4 years old. The abuse Mary faced at home was not the only trauma she experienced. She witnessed her best friend, who was only 5 years old at the time, get run over by a bus. With all this trauma, it is no wonder Mary became violent and a threat to the other children. She had been a threat long before she committed her first murder. Not a long time before she killed Martin, a boy she and Norma were playing with fell from the top of an old air raid shelter. He was severely hurt and believed that one of the girls had pushed him. Another time, Mary shoved sand down a girl's throat. These violent outbursts were normal for Mary, and her schoolmates learned to be careful around her. It makes me wonder if these tragedies could have been avoided if anyone, had recognized the signs and given this girl some much-needed help and put her in a loving home. Now, in present days, by 1980, Mary Bell was released from prison as they were impressed with her treatment and rehabilitation. She was released on a license, which technically meant she was still serving time, but could do so while under strict probation. In total, Mary Bell served just over 11 years in prison, making her 23 years old by the time she was released. Since her release from prison, Mary has given her account of her childhood and crimes to an author who wrote her biography. Mary even received money for telling her story. She gave birth to a daughter and managed to secure a court order that granted her and her daughter anonymity until her daughter turned 18. That court order was later amended to afford her lifelong anonymity and anonymity for her daughter and granddaughter. 11 years hardly seemed long enough for killing two young boys and ruining their whole family's lives. Martin Brown and Brian Howe never got a chance to grow up and live their own lives. Their families suffered so much heartbreak and stress whilst they saw their children's killers receive protection and freedom. June Richardson, Martin's mother, heartbreakingly said it's all about her and how she has to be protected. As victims, we are not given the same rights as killers. Whilst I agree and sympathise with June completely, on the other hand, Mary Bell was a sick and abused 11-year-old who desperately needed psychiatric help. This is not an excuse for Mary's actions, but her behaviour isn't normal. It takes an incredible amount of deeply inflicted pain to make people act in such vicious and violent ways. If Mary Bell had grown up in a safe and loving home, her life might have gone entirely different. Whatever your opinions are on this case, I think we can all agree on one thing: there are no winners here.